My husband used to say I worried too much about details. He said it with that patient little smile men use when they want to sound kind while quietly telling you to stay in your place. I used to let it slide because for a long time I believed that was what marriage required: patience, compromise, trust, especially trust. Looking back, trust was the most expensive thing I ever gave away. My name is Evelyn Hart. I was 34 when I took a temporary receptionist job under a false name at the company my father built and my husband ran. By then, I had already been married for 4 years, and from the outside, my life looked polished enough to make people envious. We lived in a gated neighborhood outside Palo Alto, in a glass and stone house that always photographed beautifully. My husband, Graham, was featured in business magazines as the disciplined young executive who had helped modernize Hart Microsystems after my father died. I was mentioned now and then in charity pages as his elegant private wife. That was the public version. The private version was quieter, harder to explain. There were no dramatic fights at first, no lipstick on collars, no obvious signs that would let a woman point to a single moment and say, "There." That was where everything broke. It was more like a slow draft under a closed door. Graham stopped asking how my day had been, though he always had opinions about how his had gone. He stopped eating the dinners I made unless clients were there to see him being appreciative. He started taking calls in the backyard, pacing by the pool with his voice lowered just enough to make it clear I was not included. And he began coming home later and later with the careful, polished exhaustion of a man who wanted credit for burdens I could not verify. If I asked whether he was all right, he would kiss my forehead and tell me not to spiral. Not spiral. That was his word for any question that made him uncomfortable. My father had not raised me to be suspicious by nature. If anything, he raised me to assume competence in people, until they gave me a reason not to. He started Hart Microsystems in a rented industrial unit in Fremont with 2 engineers, one folding table, and a used soldering station he bought from a closing lab. By the time I was in high school, the company had grown into a respected semiconductor supplier with government contracts, medical device partnerships, and a reputation for being disciplined where everyone else was reckless. Yet he believed in measurable things: clean ledgers, written agreements, quiet observation. He also believed, wrongly as it turned out, that Graham had the character to protect what he built. When my father got sick, it happened fast. 1 month he was still arguing with attorneys over supply chain language and rolling his eyes at consultants. 2 months later, he was in a private hospital room, thinner than I had ever seen him, speaking in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere much farther away than the bed in front of me. My mother had passed years before. I was his only child. Legally, the controlling shares transferred into a trust structure that left me with final ownership and voting control. But because I had never wanted the spotlight, and because Graham already held an operations role, that the board supported Graham stepping into the chief executive position after my father died. At the time, it even sounded sensible to me. I had an economics degree and a good head for numbers, but I was not interested in being a public-facing executive. I hated cameras. I hated investor dinners. I hated the performative confidence those rooms demanded from women twice as much as from men. Graham, on the other hand, loved all of it. He could walk into a room of bankers and make each person feel like he had already chosen them. He shook hands like he had been practicing for office since birth. He made people feel safe until it was too late to ask whether they should. And for a while, I was grateful for that. He told me to grieve. He told me he would handle the pressure. Yet he told me I did not need to sit through every board meeting or review every operating update. He said he wanted to protect me from becoming hardened by a world my father had always shielded me from. There are lies that sound cruel from the beginning, and then there are lies that arrive dressed as devotion. I let him take more space than he should have. Then I got used to him filling it. The first thing that made me truly uneasy was not another woman. It was payroll. I still reviewed high-level reports because I refused to become completely ornamental in my own life. One Thursday afternoon, almost 2 years after my father died, I was in the study going through quarterly summaries when I noticed something odd in executive support compensation. It was not a giant number. That was what made it strange. Huge fraud is loud. Real misuse often begins in places small enough to seem not worth questioning. One executive assistant's discretionary expense approvals had doubled in 6 months. I remember leaning closer to the screen and reading the name twice. Sonia Vale. I knew the name because Graham had mentioned her often enough that it had started to feel rehearsed. Sonia was apparently indispensable. Sonia handled impossible schedules. Sonia anticipated everything. Sonia knew which investors needed hand-holding and which ones wanted numbers only. Sonia, according to Graham, worked harder than half the senior leadership team. None of that was proof of anything. But when a husband starts talking about another woman too often, he usually thinks he is being subtle because he is not saying what he really means. I said nothing that night. I simply asked what his new assistant was like. He loosened his tie, accepted the glass of water I handed him, and said, "Efficient. Finally. Finally." I smiled and asked, "Better than the last three?" He gave me a look over the rim of the glass. "You don't need to sound jealous. She's 26. I had not sounded jealous. I had sounded curious. But that is what people do when they are caught off guard. They answer the accusation they think is coming instead of the question that was asked. After that, I paid closer attention. His phone stayed face down more often. He started working from the company's downtown office on weekends, even when he used to do board prep from home. He changed his gym time, then his tailor, then his cologne. When I asked why a man who had worn the same watch for 5 years suddenly cared about handmade Italian shoes, he laughed and said success had finally reached my standards. That one almost impressed me. It was efficient, make the wife sound shallow, and you never have to explain why your own tastes change. Still, I waited. I watched. I told myself I was imagining patterns because grief had made me more cautious, more territorial, maybe even smaller than I wanted to admit. Then one Saturday in late spring, I stopped by the office unannounced. That building had been part of my life since I was 8. I used to do homework in an empty conference room while my father finished supplier calls. I knew which elevator stuck between floors in humid weather. I knew which security guard always snuck cinnamon gum at the front desk. And I knew the third-floor corridor still got too cold because my father had never approved the renovation budget for that wing. Even after he died, the place still carried his habits in little invisible ways. But that day, it did not feel like his company. It felt staged, polished, segmented, like someone had replaced the soul and kept the furniture. A young man at reception stood the second I walked in, smiling with the strained politeness reserved for people who look important but are not recognized immediately. He asked if I had an appointment. I remember standing there in a cream blouse and dark sunglasses, holding my bag, staring at him long enough to make him nervous. Not because of him, because until that moment, I had never considered that my own father's building might one day require my introduction. Right before I answered, Sonia appeared. I recognized her from a charity gala 6 months earlier, though she had been seated 3 tables away and never formally introduced to me. She was beautiful in a deliberate, sharpened kind of way. Not soft, not accidental. She had glossy dark hair, a fitted ivory blouse, and the kind of posture that said she had practiced being looked at and rewarded for it. She crossed the lobby with easy authority, took one look at me, and smiled a small, professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" I took off my sunglasses. "I'm here to see Graham." Something changed in her face then, only for a second, recognition maybe, or annoyance that recognition had arrived. "He's in a strategy session. It's Saturday." "Yes," she said, still smiling. "We work very hard here." I almost laughed at that. As instead I said, "Tell him Evelyn is here." The receptionist's expression shifted immediately. Sonia's did not. That was the more interesting reaction. She tapped something on her phone, then looked back at me and said, "He's not available right now. If you'd like, I can let him know you stopped by." There are moments when a marriage ends in your body before it ends in your mind. You feel it as temperature first. The room changes. Your skin notices before your pride does. I looked past her toward the executive elevator bank and said, "No, I'll wait." She stepped slightly into my line of sight. Not enough to be called blocking me, just enough to make the message clear. I really don't think that would be best. Best for whom? I wish I could say I confronted her then. I wish I could say I went upstairs and opened every door and forced the truth into daylight in one clean, brave moment. But that is not how most women move when they sense a betrayal that could collapse their entire life. We hesitate, not because we are weak, because once you know, you cannot unknow it. Sometimes uncertainty feels like the last room with oxygen in it. So I left. I got into my car, sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, and stared at the parking structure wall until my eyes burned. Then I drove home, took off my earrings, washed my face, and made dinner for two because I had not yet figured out what kind of woman I was going to be. Graham came home after 9 and kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. I asked how his day was. He said, long. I asked who else had been in the office. He loosened his cuffs and said, just the usual people. Why? I looked at him and knew, not everything, not the mechanics, not the timeline, not the money, but I knew the marriage I thought I had was no longer real, if it had ever been real at all. And once I knew that, smaller things began to arrange themselves into a pattern I could not ignore. A limited access renovation budget approved for the executive floor without board review. Vendor contracts rerouted through a consulting layer Graham claimed was necessary for modernization. Sonia appearing in photos from investor dinners where spouses were not invited, though technically she was support staff. A watch on Graham's wrist that I had never seen before, worth more than the annual salary of half the employees in the customer service unit, new art in his office. A new liquor in the house, new passwords on devices that used to be left carelessly open on the kitchen counter. I started keeping notes, dates, comments, expense categories, unusual transfers, social events, odd absences, nothing dramatic. Just facts lined up in order, the way my father taught me to think when feelings were loud and truth was still hiding. 3 weeks later, I met with Daniel Reeves. Daniel had been Heart Microsystems' longtime outside counsel before becoming a board advisor after my father died. He was one of the few men my father trusted enough to speak freely around. He had known me since I was in braces and still corrected my grammar over dessert. If my father represented conviction, Daniel represented caution. He never overreacted, which was why I went to him before I went to anyone else. We met in his private office in Redwood City on a Thursday morning. I told him I was uneasy about Graham. I told him some executive expenses looked wrong. I told him I suspected more was happening than a simple affair, though I could not yet prove it. Daniel listened without interrupting, fingertips steepled under his chin, then asked me a question I still remember word for word. Do you want reassurance, Evelyn, or do you want the truth? At the time, I thought they might still be the same thing. The truth, I said. He nodded slowly, like a doctor preparing to discuss test results. Then don't confront him yet. What do you think is happening? I think, he said carefully, that men who are comfortable enough to humiliate their wives are often comfortable enough to misuse whatever else they think belongs to them. That sentence sat between us for a long time. I asked what he would do if he were me. He said, I would assume two things. First, if there is another woman inside the company, she is not only a personal risk, but a governance risk. Second, if Graham believes you are passive, he is more likely to be careless while performing for power. So I wait. No, he said. You observe. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave me the advice that changed everything. He said if I wanted the truth, I needed to see the company as it functioned when people believed I was nowhere near it. Not from the board packets, not from summaries, not from Graham, from inside. At first, I thought he meant a formal audit. But he shook his head before I even finished the thought. Anything official would tip Graham off. Anything routed through normal reporting lines could be cleaned before it reached me. If I wanted honest behavior, I needed unguarded access. How? I asked. Daniel's expression stayed perfectly calm. Your father kept allies in places other people forget. Reception, facilities, payroll, AHR. I stared at him. He opened a slim folder on his desk and slid a single page toward me. Temporary staffing intake forms, administrative support, entry-level operations desk. I looked up. You can't be serious. I am completely serious. That's insane. It's effective. I let out a breath and actually laughed once, quietly, because it was absurd. I had spent years avoiding executive visibility. And now the most rational man I knew was suggesting I apply for a temp job at my own company like a woman in a bad television drama. But the more I thought about it, the less absurd it became. No one below senior leadership really knew me anymore. I had kept a low profile after my father's death and almost never appeared on site. Most of the newer staff would not recognize me without the last name in the context. My hair was longer now. I wore little makeup. I could change my posture, my clothes, even the way I spoke. In a company of almost 2,000 employees spread across multiple facilities, one temporary front desk hire would disappear into the wallpaper. Unless, of course, she stepped into the wrong room. I asked Daniel whether he thought I was overreacting. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I think your father left you ownership. Graham thinks you gave him permission. Those are not the same thing. I took the forms home. For 2 days, I kept them in the drawer of my bedside table without touching them. On the third night, Graham flew to Chicago for what he said was a supply chain summit, and I sat at the kitchen island with a cup of tea gone cold and filled them out under the name Eva Mercer. Age shaved down by 2 years, university omitted, work history simplified, no mention of trusts, boards, donors, or the fact that the building I was applying to enter had once been designed around my father's habits. By midnight, the form was complete. By morning, something in me had changed. Not because I felt strong. I didn't. I felt sick. But there is a kind of strength that does not look like confidence. It looks like finally being more afraid of staying blind than of what sight might cost you. A week later, a woman in HR named Linda called to offer me a 2-week temporary placement covering an internal staffing gap at the downtown headquarters. Front desk overflow, visitor logging, pantry support, meeting room turnover, simple document handling, minimum visibility, minimum pay, immediate start. I thanked her in a voice even I barely recognized. Then I hung up and sat very still. I remember looking around the breakfast room at the clean counters, the morning light, the flowers I had arranged myself the day before, and thinking, he has no idea. That was the beginning. I did not yet know about the private dinners. I did not yet know about the side contracts. I did not yet know how casually a woman could be insulted in a building her father built with his own hands. I did not yet know how cold I was capable of becoming once the truth arrived in full. All I knew was that on Monday morning, I was going to walk into Heart Microsystems wearing a polyester blouse, cheap flats, and a temporary badge clipped to my collar. And before that first day was over, another woman was going to slap me in front of half the executive floor for touching something she called her husband's. Then I was finally going to understand exactly what kind of game they thought they were playing. On Monday morning, I left the house before sunrise in a car Graham had never seen me drive. It was an older gray sedan Daniel arranged through a friend at one of the firm's logistics vendors. Forgettable, slightly dusty. The kind of car no one looked at twice in a downtown garage. I parked 3 blocks from headquarters, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and barely recognized myself. I had flattened my hair into a low clip instead of the soft blowout Graham preferred. No jewelry except tiny studs, no wedding ring, no makeup beyond concealer and lip balm. My blouse was a pale blue synthetic thing that sat wrong on the shoulders, and the black flats pinched my heels before I even crossed the street. I carried a canvas tote with a discount pharmacy logo on the side and a plastic lunch container I had packed myself. I had spent so many years being looked at as Graham's wife, Richard Hart's daughter, the quiet woman from the foundation dinners, that walking into that lobby as no one at all felt strangely physical, like losing height. It's like the air changed pressure around me. Linda from HR met me beside reception with a clipboard and a bright, rushed smile. She was in her 50s, overly pleasant in the careful way people are when they are underpaid and watched too closely. She handed me a temporary badge that read EVA Mercer in block letters and led me through the basics at a speed that made it clear no one expected this role to matter. Visitor sign-ins, break room restocking, conference room resets, light calendar support if asked, no wandering onto executive floors unless specifically instructed. That last part almost made me smile. I kept my voice softer than usual and added a slight nervousness to it. Not enough to seem incompetent, just enough to seem ordinary. People are generous with their cruelty when they think you're harmless. But by 8:30, I was stationed near the second floor admin desk, sorting visitor packets and answering delivery calls. The first thing I noticed was the tone of the place. My father's company had always been demanding, but it used to be steady, direct, sharp-edged, yes, but not theatrical. What I found instead was a kind of polished fear. People watched themselves before they spoke. Managers hovered too long behind chairs. Assistants flinched when messages from the executive suite came through. Even the jokes were careful. Around 10, 2 junior analysts passed the desk and one muttered to the other, "No, don't send that version yet. If Sonia sees it before he does, she'll tear your face off." They said it lightly, as if it were funny. But I heard the truth underneath. Not Graham, Sonia. But by lunch, I had already learned more than any board packet had told me in a year. People timed their emails around her moods. Senior managers went through her before requesting time with Graham. Procurement approvals were delayed if she was offended. A facilities supervisor whispered to another employee that the executive suite pantry now required imported sparkling water because she doesn't like domestic brands on her floor. No one said her last name because no one needed to. Inside that building, there was only one woman important enough to cause that kind of tension without a title that justified it: Sonia. At 11:40, I got my first clear look at her. She came off the executive elevator with Graham half a step behind her, which told me more than if they had been touching. He was on his phone, dressed in a charcoal suit I had sent out for pressing 2 days before. She was carrying a tablet and laughing at something he had just said. Not office laughing, not polite laughter, the kind that comes from confidence, familiarity, possession. He glanced up once while they crossed the lobby. My whole body locked, but his eyes passed over me like I was furniture. I had known rationally that the disguise would work. Still, there is something deeply humiliating about the ease with which a husband fails to recognize his own wife when she is stripped of context and status. I stood there holding a stack of folders, feeling heat rise under my collar, and watched him place a hand at the small of Sonia's back as they moved toward the private conference hall. It was light, casual, the sort of gesture he would have denied meaning anything. But people do not place their hands on subordinates like that unless they have already decided the boundary is gone. I spent the next 2 hours fighting the urge to march upstairs and drag the truth out by force. Instead, I kept working, restocking water, logging packages, smiling when spoken to, learning the names of people who barely looked at me. Observation, Daniel had said. So I observed. At 1:15, a catering mix-up sent me to the 6th floor with a tray of boxed lunches intended for a smaller strategy room. That was how I first saw the divide with my own eyes. The 6th floor had been renovated recently. I knew because I had approved a general modernization budget the year before, but I had never seen what it became in practice. My father's version of an executive area had been plain wood, good coffee, functional leather chairs, and a strict hatred of waste. Graham's version looked like a boutique hotel trying to impress foreign investors. Dark stone counters, imported lighting, framed abstract art with no apparent relation to anything the company actually did. There was even a private dining section along the far side behind frosted glass. 2 engineers in standard badges stepped out of an elevator with me and headed instinctively toward the main cafeteria corridor, then stopped when a woman in a fitted navy dress at a host station said, "Sorry, staff seating is downstairs unless you're on the executive list." Staff seating. As if the people building the actual products were a lower species than the men discussing them over plated salmon. As I delivered the lunches to the smaller conference room and was turning back when I heard voices behind the frosted partition. One of them was Sonia's. "You need to fix payroll before quarter close," she said. "If they catch the duplicate approval chain now, it'll look sloppy." My hand tightened on the empty tray. Graham answered too quietly for every word to carry, but I caught enough. "Told you not to use the same vendor twice." Then Sonia again, irritated now. "Relax, Linda already buried the first exception report." Linda, the HR woman who had hired me. I kept walking because a cleaning staff member was coming down the hall and I could not risk being found standing still outside a private dining area with an empty tray and a listening face. But my pulse was hammering so hard that by the time I reached the service elevator, I had to stand there for a full 5 seconds, breathing through my nose like I had run a race. Duplicates approval chain, vendor twice, exception report buried. That was not flirtation. That was process manipulation. I wrote the phrases down in the notes app on the cheap backup phone Daniel had told me to use. Then I deleted them and rewrote them by hand once I got downstairs. No digital trail unless necessary. By mid-afternoon, Sonia had decided she disliked me. I don't think it was because she recognized me. If she had, her behavior would have shifted more carefully. No, it was simpler than that. Women like Sonia can smell uncertainty the way certain dogs smell fear. I was new, quiet, and not yet sorted into a category she found useful. And that meant I was available to be diminished. She called me over from the admin station with one crooked finger, while 2 department coordinators stood nearby. "This is wrong," she said, handing me a printed visitor schedule without even looking up. "Were you raised without margins?" I took the page and said, "I'm sorry, I can reprint it." She gave a short laugh. "Of course you can. That was the question." The coordinators looked down immediately. No one wanted to be seen reacting. I reprinted it, brought it back. She took it from me, scanned it for half a second, then set it aside untouched. She had not needed the correction. She had needed the display. Later, she sent me back downstairs for oat milk she could easily have ordered from pantry stock. Then back up again because it was the wrong brand. Then again because she had changed her mind and wanted lemon water instead. Every errand was timed to make me cross the building as much as possible while she watched from a distance like she was training a pet. The old me might have taken it personally. The woman I was becoming took notes. At 4:20, Graham came through the admin area alone and paused near my station while checking something on his phone. He was close enough that I could smell the cologne I had once bought him for our anniversary. My heartbeat got so loud I was sure someone would hear it. He looked at the badge clipped to my shirt. Eva, right? I lowered my eyes slightly and nodded. Yes, sir. It was the first time I had called my husband, sir. Something small and clean broke inside me, he said. But you're helping Sonia this week? Yes. He slipped his phone into his pocket and gave me the same smile he used on waiters, hotel staff, valets, anyone whose good opinion cost him nothing. She can be demanding. Don't take it personally. There it was, that mild, polished tone, the one that framed a woman's cruelty as an unavoidable weather pattern and a lower employee's pain as oversensitivity. I said, no, sir. He nodded once and walked away. I stood there staring at the empty space he left behind and realized something that hurt more than I expected. He was not pretending with her. He was himself. The softer version he had once used on me, the patient management style, the warm reassurance, the confident charm, none of it had disappeared. It had simply been reassigned. At home that night, he was almost cheerful, and he poured himself bourbon, asked if I'd had a restful day, mentioned that the company was entering a critical leadership phase and that people under him were struggling to keep up. Then he complained about incompetence for 10 full minutes while I spooned roasted vegetables onto his plate and watched the man lying to my face with the ease of long practice. Do you ever feel, I asked lightly, that you trust the wrong people? He looked up. What do you mean? Nothing, I said. Just thinking. He smiled faintly, reached for the salt, and said, That's always dangerous. I barely slept. On Tuesday, the pattern deepened. Linda from HR avoided eye contact when she passed me in the hall. An accounts payable employee came to the admin desk looking for a signature escalation and got visibly nervous when he realized it routed through Sonia instead of an actual finance approver. A senior engineer whispered to another that the girlfriend has more budget power than the product leads, then went pale when he realized I could hear him. By noon, I understood the internal culture better than I had in the last 18 months as owner. Graham had not simply had an affair. He had built a parallel court around it. Loyalty to Sonia bought access. Access to Graham bought resources. Questioning either of them meant career damage. And because I had spent too long absent from the building, that ecosystem had grown without enough resistance. The humiliation of realizing this was different from the humiliation of infidelity. It was larger, colder. My father left me a company, and I had let my marriage become the smokescreen someone used to hollow it out. That day I was assigned lunch support on the 6th floor. The executive dining area sat above the main cafeteria on a raised section with glass railings and muted lighting. Employees joked about it downstairs and called it the balcony, though never where management could hear. It overlooked the main lunch floor in a way I found instantly vulgar. You could sit there with a linen napkin and literally look down on the rest of the company. At 12:40, Sonia arrived with 3 managers and claimed the corner table. She had changed into a cream blazer and gold earrings, as if lunch were another performance slot in a day made of them. On the table in front of her sat a black insulated flask I knew better than my own pulse. As I had ordered that flask 2 Christmases ago from a small workshop in Portland because Graham said he wanted something durable for travel days. Matte black, brushed steel cap, his initials engraved near the base, GH. I used to fill it myself some mornings with tea when he had early meetings. Seeing it on her table turned my stomach so hard I had to grip the tray card to steady my hand. One of the managers said, "He still uses that thing?" Sonia smiled and unscrewed the cap. "Only when I remember to bring it." Not when he remembers, when I remember. There are sentences that sound tiny until you understand the amount of trespass packed inside them. She took a slow sip while the men at the table laughed at something else. Casual, possessive, public, no effort to hide it. That meant one of two things. Either they were all fools, or they believed themselves fully protected. I was still standing there trying to keep my face blank when one of the pantry servers got called away to help with a spill downstairs. The host station woman looked at me and said, "Ava, can you clear the empty place settings from the VIP side?" So I did. I moved table to table, lifting plates, replacing glasses, keeping my eyes lowered. When I reached Sonia's section, she didn't look at me. She was mid-story, telling the managers about a Napa resort Graham wanted to possibly use for an off-site, though the smile on her face suggested that was not the real reason she knew the details. My ears rang, not from anger exactly, from the effort of staying still. Then I saw the flask again, sitting inches from the edge of the table, the engraving half turned toward me. It was absurdly intimate. That object. Not because of the price or the initials, because it belonged to the life inside my house, because I had washed it in my own sink. And something in me made a choice before my mind caught up. I reached for it, unscrewed the cap, and took a drink. The tea inside was still warm, ginger and mint. I knew the blend instantly because I was the one who had taught Graham to like it when he kept complaining coffee made his hands shake before presentations. For half a second, the entire table froze. Then Sonia stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Every voice in that section went silent. Conversations from nearby tables thinned and stopped. I lowered the flask deliberately and looked at her. I was thirsty. It was a stupid answer. Too calm, too plain. Right, but I think some detached part of me wanted to hear how far she would go if she believed I was powerless. She came around the table with murder in her face. "That is my husband's." My husband's. The words rang across the glass railing and down into the cafeteria below. I saw heads turning, staff looking up, managers going still. One of the men at her table half rose, then sat back down immediately, as if he understood instinctively that he was watching something dangerous and wanted no part of it. I said very quietly, "Is it?" Her hand moved before anyone else did. The slap cracked across my face so hard it turned my head. For one bright second, all I could see was white light and the edge of the table blurring sideways. The cap of the flask rolled across the floor and hit a chair leg. Somewhere below us, a tray crashed. But my left cheek burned. My ear rang. And in the strange, clean silence after the strike, I tasted blood where the inside of my mouth had hit my teeth. Sonia was breathing hard, chest rising under that cream blazer, one hand still half lifted from the force of what she'd done. No one spoke. No one moved. I straightened slowly and put my fingertips to the corner of my mouth. When I pulled them away, there was a thin red streak. She looked at it, then at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. Not remorse, just the tiniest fear that maybe she had crossed a line visible even to the people who usually protected her. Then the elevator doors at the far end opened, and Graham stepped out onto the executive floor. The timing was so sharp it almost felt staged. Graham stepped off the executive elevator with his phone in one hand and an annoyed look already forming. Probably expecting some minor interruption he could smooth over in 30 seconds. He took 2 steps onto the dining floor, saw the crowd, saw Sonia standing there with her arms still tense at her side, and then saw me. Not Evelyn in our kitchen, not Evelyn sitting across from him at charity dinners. Not Evelyn in silk, quiet and composed and easy to underestimate. Just a temporary admin in a cheap blouse, one side of her face turning red in front of half the executive floor. And the second he recognized me, all the color drained out of his face. I had wondered before that moment whether he would be a good liar under direct pressure. Some men are. Some only look powerful until they no longer control the script. This Graham turned out to be the second kind. He stopped walking so abruptly that the older investor relations director behind him almost walked into his back. Sonia turned toward him at once, expecting rescue, validation, maybe even applause. Her voice came out sharp and indignant. "Thank God this girl is insane. She grabbed your flask and drank from it right in front of everyone. She said your flask the way some women say my ring, my seat, my place." Graham didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on me. I held his gaze and said nothing. I wanted him to feel the full weight of the silence. I wanted him to understand, before a single word was spoken, that whatever version of control he thought he had left was already bleeding out on the floor between us. Sonia tugged lightly at his sleeve. "But Graham," He looked down at her hand like it had appeared there by mistake. Then he pulled his arm away. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. But everyone saw. The room changed. Power is strange like that. It can take months to build and 1 second to expose as theater. A moment earlier, Sonia had been standing in the center of that executive lunch area like a crowned queen. Now every person there was recalculating in real time. I dabbed at the blood at the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand and spoke before Graham could gather himself. She said it was her husband's. No one moved. No one even pretended not to understand. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked around at the faces watching him. Directors, managers, support staff, catering workers. It's people from the lower level leaning up over the railing to see. He knew whatever came out next would live in the building long after lunch ended. Sonia gave a thin, disbelieving laugh. What is happening? I turned to her fully. That's what I'd like to know. Her eyes narrowed. Excuse me? You seem very comfortable using the word husband in public, I said. The tone of my own voice surprised me. It was not loud. It was not emotional. It was almost calm enough to sound bored. That made it worse. A raised voice can be dismissed as hysteria. Calm makes people listen. Sonia looked at Graham for support, then back at me. I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but you need to go before I have security remove you. A few people actually winced at that. I took one step closer. Security? I asked. No, for drinking out of a flask my husband has carried to work for 2 years? Her face emptied, not understanding yet, but close. I watched the moment land piece by piece. The flask, Graham's silence, the way he had pulled away from her, the fact that I was no longer lowering my eyes, the fact that my voice did not belong to a frightened temp. The blood left her face so quickly it was almost impressive. She looked at Graham again, this time not with outrage, but with something much uglier. Panic. I could have ended it there. I could have said my name immediately and let the shock do the rest. But after the slap, after the weeks of lies, after standing in my own father's building being treated like disposable help by the woman wearing my husband's arrogance like perfume, I wanted every second of her certainty to rot before I took it away. So I said it slowly. The lawful wife of Graham Hart is standing right in front of you. Someone downstairs gasped loud enough for everyone to hear. Sonia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Graham one last time, and what she found in his face must have told her everything because she took a half step backward on instinct. He still said nothing. That, more than anything, destroyed her. If he had laughed, denied it, called me unstable, maybe she could have clung to the performance a little longer. But men like Graham always save their best silence for the moment their cowardice becomes visible. One of the senior managers at Sonia's table stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. Mrs. Hart? I finally looked away from Sonia and met his eyes. Yes, that was enough. The name spread through the crowd like current through a wire. Mrs. Hart, Evelyn, Richard Hart's daughter, owner. I could almost hear the internal revisions happening. Every dismissive interaction, every ignored concern, every rumor, every compromise people had made because they thought the executive suite was untouchable. Sonia recovered just enough to get angry again, which would have been almost admirable if it weren't so pathetic. She pointed at me with a shaking finger. No, that's not possible, he said. Then she stopped herself. Too late. I tilted my head. He said, what? Her eyes widened. Graham shut his eyes briefly, as if the question itself hurt him. That tiny movement gave me more satisfaction than I expected. I turned back to him. Go on, tell them. Evelyn, he said, finally finding his voice. Hey, let's not do this here. There it was. Not an apology, not concern, just the desperate instinct of a man trying to relocate his humiliation to a more private room. I laughed once, quietly, because I honestly couldn't help it. Here is exactly where we're doing it. The investor relations director behind him took 2 slow steps away. Sonia's lunch companions had already made the kind of subtle physical retreat people do when they sense legal exposure. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast. I looked at Graham's face, at the sweat already beginning near his hairline, and realized that for all his polish, he had never once pictured me as his equal in conflict. He had pictured me hurt, certainly. Devastated, maybe. Quiet, absolutely. But not this. Never this. He tried again, voice lower. Matt, you're upset. That almost made me angry enough to smile. I'm bleeding in public because your mistress slapped me over a flask I bought for you. The whole floor went still again. Not because the accusation was shocking by then, but because I said mistress so cleanly. No hesitation, no drama, just fact. Sonia turned on him then, really turned, and I watched betrayal hit her from the other side. You told me you were separated. No one looked surprised that she said it. They looked interested. Graham swallowed. Sonia, you said she lived in Connecticut. I stared at him. Connecticut. Not even a creative lie. Just far enough away to keep me abstract. He looked at me then with a kind of pleading I had never seen before, and it disgusted me so deeply I felt cold all the way down my arms. Evelyn, let me explain. No, I said. But you can explain to legal. I took out my phone, not dramatically, not with a flourish, just enough for people to see it. Sonia saw the movement and straightened abruptly. What are you doing? Documenting, I said. That word had a visible effect on more than one face in the crowd. I opened the voice memo app and replayed the last 30 seconds I had managed to catch after the slap. Not the whole incident, just enough. Her voice shrieking my own, then the sharp crack of impact and the scrape of chairs. The sound cut through the dining floor in a way visuals never could. Violence always gets more real when people hear it. I stopped the playback and looked at Graham. She assaulted me on company property during business hours in front of witnesses, I said. So whatever private version of this disaster you were hoping to manage is over. He looked like he might actually be sick. Sonia was staring at my phone now, as if it were a weapon. I barely touched you. I raised an eyebrow. That's helpful. Say it louder. She shut up. At that point, a woman from HRI, recognized from onboarding, came rushing in from the elevator bank, breathless and pale. Linda. She took in the scene, saw my face, saw Graham, saw Sonia, and immediately looked like she wished the floor would open. Mrs. Hart, she said softly. That was the first time anyone from HR had addressed me correctly in that building in over a year. I looked at her and saw something complicated in her expression. Fear, yes, but also recognition. Maybe guilt, maybe calculation. Linda, I said, I'd like a written incident report started immediately. Full witness list, security footage preserved, no deletions, no edits, no restricted access flags without outside counsel copied. Graham took a step forward. That won't be necessary. I turned so fast he actually stopped. Won't it? He lowered his voice. You're making this worse. No, I said. I'm making it official. That line moved through the crowd like a blade. Sonia let out a dry laugh that sounded half-cracked. Are you really going to pretend this is about one slap? No, I said. I'm not pretending anything anymore. For the first time, I let the full contempt show in my face. This is about the fact that you felt comfortable calling my husband yours in a room full of employees. Her lips parted, closed, opened again. In fact, it's about the fact that no one here seemed surprised that I continued. It's about the fact that he let you use his position, his office, and apparently his personal property like some cheap little domestic fantasy in the middle of a public company. Graham flinched. Good. And I said, looking at him now instead of her, it's about how long you thought I'd stay home and never notice. He rubbed a hand over his mouth. Can we please take this upstairs? The old reflex in me, to avoid scenes, to preserve appearances, to handle pain privately, so other people would stay comfortable, rose for 1 weak second, and then died. I was done protecting him from public consequences while he humiliated me in private. No, I said again. Then I turned to Linda. Who oversees building security today? She blinked. Martin Chen. Call him. Graham's whole posture tightened. Evelyn. Now, I said, still to Linda. She nodded and stepped aside to make the call. Sonia laughed again, but it was breaking apart now. This is insane. You can't seriously think you're going to destroy everything over a misunderstanding. I looked at her for a long moment. A misunderstanding, I repeated. Then, because I wanted her to understand exactly how completely she had misjudged me, I reached out and lifted the flask from the table one more time. I turned it so the engraving caught the light. GH. I picked this design, I said. I wrapped it myself at Christmas. He used it the morning after our anniversary dinner while telling me I was the only person who really understood him. Sonia's eyes flicked to Graham. What she saw there finished the job. Her face changed. And not into shame. People like her rarely arrive there cleanly. It changed into the specific fury of a woman realizing she has not been the chosen replacement she imagined. Just the current accessory, a prop with an ego. You lied to me, she said to him. He answered too late and too softly. Sonia, she shoved his shoulder. Not hard, but hard enough that everyone saw it. You said she was gone. There it was again. I stored every word. He grabbed for her wrist on instinct, maybe to quiet her, maybe to control the moment, and she yanked away so sharply her chair nearly toppled. Don't touch me. For a half second, I considered stepping back and letting the two of them tear each other open in front of the entire floor. Part of me wanted that, but the larger part, the part that sounded more and more like my father by the minute, they knew spectacle was only useful if it led somewhere measurable. So I intervened, not with volume, but with precision. Save it, I said. Both of you. They both looked at me. I held Graham's eyes and asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since Saturday. Who approved the executive floor renovation budget increase? His expression went blank for one dangerous second. Sonia looked between us, confused. I kept going. And why is HR bearing exception reports? Linda, across the room, froze with the phone at her ear. Now that got a reaction. Real fear, not marital embarrassment, not romantic exposure, something colder. Graham straightened. This is not the time. I took a step toward him. No, this is exactly when you started running out of time. Martin from security arrived with two guards just then. Both men slowing the second they realized the person with the red cheek and bloody lip was not a temp at all. He looked at Graham first, then at me, then at Linda, trying to read the hierarchy. I saved him the trouble. I want a copy of all camera footage from this floor preserved from noon to now, I said. I also want access logs for executive dining and private suite entries for the last 90 days secured before anyone touches them. Graham spoke over me. Martin, don't do anything yet. Martin hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the problem with brutal clarity. My father had left me ownership on paper, but Graham had spent years training the building to respond to his voice first, so I fixed that. I turned slightly, enough for everyone around us to hear, and said, as majority owner of this company, I am instructing security to preserve records immediately pending council review. If anyone interferes, they will be treated as obstructing an internal investigation. You could feel the sentence land. Martin nodded at once. Understood. Graham went white again. Sonia whispered, Majority owner? No one answered her. They didn't need to. By then, the entire executive lunch floor had become one living rumor. More people had gathered near the elevators. A few had clearly taken out their phones, though discreetly. I knew the story would spread through the building in 10 minutes and through the industry in 10 days. That should have horrified me. Oddly, it didn't. What horrified me was how close I had come to never knowing any of it. Linda ended her call and came back over, voice tight. Now we can prepare a conference room for a formal report. I nodded. Good. Then I looked at Graham, really looked at him, at the expensive suit, the careful haircut, the face I had once mistaken for safety. And I said the one thing I knew would follow him all the way into whatever came next. You should start thinking less about lunch and more about what's in your email. His eyes changed instantly, just for a second, but I saw it. And the second I saw it, I knew this was bigger than cheating, much bigger. I didn't say another word. I handed the flask to Martin like evidence, picked up my canvas tote, and walked toward the conference wing without waiting to see whether Graham followed. Behind me, I heard Sonia finally lose what was left of her composure. What does that mean? She shouted at him. Graham, what does she mean? I kept walking, because by then I already understood something important. A man can survive being exposed as unfaithful. What he cannot survive is the moment his wife realizes he has been stealing from her too. The conference room they put us in was one of the smaller legal review rooms on the 5th floor. Frosted glass, no windows, a long walnut table, a wall monitor no one turned on. I had sat in rooms like that before for board prep and donor briefings, but never as the injured party in my own marriage. Linda brought in bottled water with both hands like she was approaching a live wire. Martin from security stood near the door with a sealed evidence envelope containing the flask and instructions already sent to his team to preserve the footage. As a junior HR specialist I didn't know sat down with a legal pad and looked so nervous I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Graham came in last. He had finally put some color back into his face, but it was the brittle kind, controlled only from a distance. Up close, he looked like a man trying to hold together 10 collapsing stories at once. Sonia wasn't with him. Good. I had no interest in watching him perform damage control for both relationships at the same time. The minute the door closed, he turned to me and said, "You've made your point." I actually smiled at that, not because it was funny, because it told me exactly where his head still was. "My point?" I repeated. He lowered his voice, glancing at Linda and Martin as if they were an inconvenience rather than witnesses. "Do we really need them in here?" "Yes," I said. Miss Linda sat straighter. The junior HR specialist uncapped her pen so quickly she nearly dropped it. Graham pulled out a chair and sat across from me, with the same careful posture he used in negotiations. That should have warned him. The fact that he still thought this was a negotiation meant he had not caught up to the situation at all. "Evelyn," he said, "whatever you think you saw." I cut in immediately. "I saw your mistress slap me in public after claiming a personal item I bought for my husband belonged to her." He pressed his lips together. Then he tried a new angle. "Sonia has been under pressure." That was the first moment I truly hated him. Not because he cheated, not because he lied, but because even now, even with my face marked and half the company buzzing through the walls outside. Yes, his first instinct was to contextualize the woman who hit me. I leaned back in my chair and said, "That's your defense?" "It's not a defense. It sounds exactly like a defense." Linda looked down at the table. Martin's expression didn't move. Graham rubbed his thumb over the edge of the chair arm. "I'm trying to de-escalate this." "No," I said quietly. "You're trying to shrink it." That shut him up. The HR specialist asked me to describe the incident for the record. I did, calmly, step by step. The sixth floor dining area, the flask, Sonia's statement that it was her husband's, the slap, the visible injury, the witnesses present, Graham's arrival, his initial silence, Sonia's claim that he had told her I was effectively gone. I made sure every sentence stayed factual, no adjectives I couldn't defend, no emotional flourishes he could later frame as instability. Then I requested copies of the full report, witness list, camera footage preservation notice, and badge access logs related to the executive floor. Graham interrupted at that. "Badge access logs? For what?" I turned my head slowly and looked at him. "For the investigation." "There is no investigation." Martin shifted at the door. Linda went absolutely still. I said, "That's interesting." "What is?" "The way you answered that so quickly." His jaw tightened. "Because this is personal." "No," I said. "The affair is personal. A subordinate with informal influence over executive access, budget visibility, and HR shielding is a governance problem." He laughed once under his breath, the old dismissive laugh, the one he used when he wanted to imply I was reaching beyond my expertise. "Now you've been reading too many legal memos." There was a time that line would have made me step back and check my footing. That was the thing about Graham. He never shouted first. He corrected, minimized, tilted the room half an inch until you questioned your own balance. It had taken me too long to understand that charm and condescension often wear the same tie. So I said, "And you've been writing too many unauthorized checks." He froze. Not Linda, not Martin, just him. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. The involuntary stillness of someone who did not expect the conversation to move there yet. I didn't give him time to recover. "What exactly is the relationship between Sonia Vale and executive discretionary approvals?" He stared at me. "What are you talking about?" "You tell me." "This is absurd." "Is it?" His eyes sharpened. "Now you've been snooping." Interesting choice of word. "Observing," I said. "There's a difference." He stood up then, sudden and angry enough that the HR specialist dropped her pen. "You took a fake job in my company to spy on me?" "Your company, not our company, not Heart Microsystems, not even the company. My company." The wording slid across the table like a knife. I let the silence sit long enough for Linda to hear it too. Then I said, "Thank you." His face changed. He had realized too late what he had handed me. He sat back down more slowly this time. "You know what I meant?" "Yes," I said, "I do." No one else spoke for a few seconds. Then Linda very carefully asked whether I wanted medical attention for my face. I said no, but I wanted photographs taken immediately for the report. She nodded and made a note. When the HR specialist excused herself to arrange that, Graham leaned forward and dropped the performance. "I made mistakes," he said quietly. "I'll admit that. But you are about to create a public disaster that could tank the company before funding closes." There it was, the true argument. Not love, not remorse, value. I folded my hands in front of me. "You're worried about funding. You should be too." "I am." "Then stop acting emotionally." Martin looked at the floor. Linda shut her eyes for the briefest moment. I felt something inside me settle all the way down. He still thought naming me emotional would lower my value in the room. Even now, even bleeding, even documented, even exposed, he still believed he could move me back into the decorative wife role with one well-placed word. So I said very evenly, the next thing you say to me should be either a confession or a resignation." He stared at me. I stared back. He chose neither. Instead, he said, "You have no idea how much I've done to hold this place together." That line carried more truth than he intended, because men who say that often mean, "You have no idea how much I've taken." I stood, not dramatically, just enough to signal that whatever private back and forth he had imagined was over. "I want access to the executive expense files from the last 18 months, I said to Linda. "I also want a list of all vendors added through discretionary channels during that period. No notice to any executive office before the files are preserved." Linda swallowed. "I can make that request." "To whom?" She hesitated. "Exactly," I answered for her. "To no one in his chain." Then I looked at Martin. "It's until outside counsel arrives, no one removes physical files from the sixth floor executive wing. No paper shredding, no off-hours access, no exceptions." Martin nodded once. "Understood." Graham stood too. "You can't lock down the executive floor based on a domestic issue." I turned to face him fully. "You really still don't understand what's happening, do you?" His nostrils flared. "Enlighten me." I reached into my canvas tote and took out the small notebook I had been using all week. Cheap spiral binding, bent cover, nothing impressive. I set it on the table between us. "Monday," I said. "Private dining area. You and Sonia discussing duplicate vendor usage and a Barrett exception report." Linda's eyes flicked up instantly. "Tuesday. Repeated references from staff to Sonia having approval power outside her title." I turned a page. "Visible personal use of your engraved flask during executive lunch in front of managers." Another page. "Saturday before last. Sonia preventing me from reaching your office while you were supposedly in a strategy session." Another. "Repeated after-hours access, weekend office occupancy, and informal control over who sees you and when." Graham said nothing. I went on. "And the phrase that interested me most, fix payroll before quarter close." No one moved. It was almost beautiful, that silence. Not because it was dramatic, because it meant the room had finally shifted from scandal to risk. And risk is where people stop defending men like Graham out of habit. He looked at the notebook like it was contaminated. "This proves nothing." "No," I agreed. "Not by itself." Then I leaned slightly closer and lowered my voice. "But it proves I knew enough to start looking." That hit him hard, because now he had to wonder what else I had seen, what else I might already have, whether today's humiliation was the whole disaster or only the public part. He sat back down slowly. That was when Daniel walked in. He didn't knock. He simply entered with a dark suit, a leather briefcase, and the expression of a man who had already heard enough to skip pleasantries. Behind him was Marisol Vega, an external employment attorney I recognized by reputation even before Daniel introduced her. Sharp, unsmiling, expensive. The kind of lawyer companies hire when they want facts before spin. Graham's face did something ugly then, not fear exactly, more like offense, as if it insulted him that I had moved faster than he expected. Daniel set his briefcase on the table and nodded to me first. "Are you all right?" "My cheek hurts," I said. "Otherwise, yes." He gave one brief glance to the red mark on my face, then turned to Graham with a look I had only seen once before years ago when a vendor tried to cheat my father on a supply contract. "Don't say anything stupid," Daniel said. Graham gave a hard little laugh. "You're representing her now?" "I'm protecting the company," Daniel said. Marisol stepped in before Graham could answer. "From this point forward, we are directing preservation of documents, access records, communications, executive expense approvals, HR exception handling, and any informal authority exercised by non-titled staff." She said it like reading weather data. Graham crossed his arms. "Yet you can't just barge in and assume misconduct." Marisol looked at him the way surgeons look at tissue. "No one is assuming," she said. "We're preserving." Then she turned to Linda and asked for immediate access to the incident report, camera retention confirmations, Sixth floor badge logs, Sonia Vale's employment file, reporting structure, compensation adjustments, discretionary access history, and any complaints tied to executive office conduct over the last 2 years. Linda looked overwhelmed, but also relieved, like someone who had spent too long waiting for grown-ups to arrive. Daniel sat beside me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. Did he say anything useful? Yes. What? He called it his company. Daniel's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Good. That one word steadied me more than anything had all day. When because the truth is, no matter how calm I looked, my nerves were raw. My cheek throbbed. My stomach was tight. My marriage was disintegrating in a legal conference room while strangers documented it. There was nothing glamorous about any of it. This wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. It was work. Painful, exacting work. The kind my father respected because it didn't rely on speeches. Marisol asked me a few narrow questions about timing, access, and what I had personally heard versus what I had inferred. I answered carefully. She approved with the slightest nod each time I separated fact from suspicion. That mattered. Then she asked Graham whether he wanted to make any formal statement regarding the incident or Sonia's role in the company. He went quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, I want my own counsel present. Marisol nodded. Oh, that's sensible. Daniel added, for once. Graham ignored him. But before the meeting broke, he looked at me and tried one final time to reach for the old dynamic. Evelyn, he said, whatever you think this becomes, remember that I built the last 3 years of this company. I looked straight at him. No, I said. You occupied them. That was the last direct sentence I gave him that day. After that, things moved quickly. Photographs were taken of my face. Security sent written confirmation that footage from the sixth floor and executive corridors had been preserved. Linda delivered Sonia's personnel file to Marisol's team under seal. By 5 o'clock, Daniel had me moved into a private office, 2 floors away from Graham's suite, with restricted access and a temporary assistant from outside staffing. The Marisol's team began pulling records. Martin reassigned overnight security coverage on the executive level. Graham's access was not yet suspended, but for the first time since my father died, he was no longer operating unobserved. I should have gone home. Instead, I stayed, not because I was strong, because I no longer trusted what might disappear if I left. At 7:30, Daniel brought me tea in a paper cup and shut the office door behind him. They've found irregularities already, he said. I looked up from the legal pad in front of me. What kind? Approval routing, expense layering, compensation adjustments that don't align cleanly with role. Sonia? Yes. I let out a slow breath. Enough? Enough to keep going. That was not the same as enough to win. I knew that. He knew that. But it was the first solid thing anyone had said all day that wasn't built on betrayal or embarrassment. I asked him whether he thought Graham would run. Daniel considered that. No, men like him don't run early. They negotiate too long because they believe they can still charm the structure. I almost smiled. That sounds like something my father would say. It is, he said. We sat in silence for a moment after that. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since lunch. Did my father know Graham was capable of this? Daniel looked genuinely tired then. I think your father knew Graham admired power too much, he said. I don't think he understood how quickly admiration would become entitlement once the room was his. That hurt in a strange new way, not just as a wife, as a daughter, but because some part of me had always believed my father's judgment was a shield. Realizing even he could be wrong about a man like Graham made the world feel less orderly than I wanted. Daniel stood to leave, then paused at the door. There's one more thing. What? It is pulling executive archive access now. If he used company systems sloppily, we'll know more tonight. I nodded. He rested his hand on the doorknob. Go to the hotel after this. Don't go home with him. I wasn't planning to. Good. When he left, I looked around the borrowed office. Beige walls, generic art, a borrowed charging cable on the desk, my cheap temp tote on one chair, my real handbag beside it, 2 versions of myself in one room. Sometime after 8, the phone on the desk rang. Not my cell, the internal line. I almost didn't answer. When I did, that no one spoke for a second, then Sonia said, You ruined my life today. Her voice sounded different, stripped of performance. Younger, harsher, not fragile, just cornered. I leaned back in the chair and said, "You slapped the owner of the company in public while sleeping with her husband. I'd review your sequence before blaming me." She made a sound between a laugh and a choke. "He told me you didn't care." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he had. Men like Graham never present wives as people. They present them as obstacles: cold, absent, difficult, fragile, uninterested. It changes based on audience, but the purpose is always the same: to make betrayal look like a reaction instead of a decision. "He lies easily," I said. "You should know that by now." Silence, then lower, sharper. "You think this is all him?" That made me open my eyes. "What does that mean?" She breathed out through her nose. "It means if you're going after him, you'd better go all the way." Before I could answer, the line went dead. I sat there staring at the receiver, every nerve suddenly alert again. Because that didn't sound like a mistress defending herself. It sounded like someone deciding whether to flip. And if Sonia was scared enough to turn on Graham, then whatever Marisol and Daniel were pulling from the records was only the surface. By 9:15, Daniel came back one more time, and the look on his face told me I had been right. "They found a second channel," he said. I stood up. "What second channel?" He held out a printed sheet. 3 vendor entities, newer than the others, layered beneath a facilities and hospitality consulting umbrella, approved during the last 10 months, paid fast. Audited lightly, connected through registered agents and address overlaps that were too close to be coincidence. I scanned the page once, then again. One of the names meant nothing. The second was linked to a holding mailbox in San Jose. The third made my stomach go cold. Vale Strategy Group, Sonia's last name. And underneath the vendor address, buried in the formation records, was an apartment number I knew by heart, because it was the unit Graham had once told me he kept for late nights near the office before claiming he'd given it up. He hadn't given it up. He had routed money through it. I looked up at Daniel, and for the first time all day, revenge stopped being the right word for what I felt. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was theft. The second I saw the address, the last loose thread in my mind pulled tight. As for 4 years, I had been trying to understand my marriage as if the central injury were emotional. Betrayal, humiliation, infidelity, all of that was true and all of it hurt. But standing there in that borrowed office with Daniel across from me and the vendor sheet in my hand, I finally understood that Graham had never divided his life into love and money the way decent people do. To him, everything was leverage. Marriage was leverage. My grief was leverage. The company was leverage. And Sonia, whatever else she was, had not simply been a mistress. She had been part of the mechanism. I set the paper down very carefully. "How much?" I asked. Daniel answered without softening it. "We don't know the full number yet, but enough to trigger board intervention tonight if we choose. Not if we should, if we choose, that mattered. Because once we moved formally, there was no reversing any of it. Not the marriage, not Graham's position, not the public consequences, not the investor questions, not the legal exposure. The whole machine would start rolling, and the only choice left after that would be whether to survive it well or badly. I looked at the clock on the office wall, 9:23. I asked, "Can we get the board together before morning?" Daniel nodded once. "Arthur's already working on it." Arthur Cole had been my father's closest friend on the board and one of the few senior directors who still called me directly instead of routing everything through Graham's office. Thick silver hair, brutal patience, no tolerance for self-invented kings. If Arthur had already been pulled in, then the night was moving faster than I'd realized. "But what about Graham?" I asked. Daniel's expression stayed flat. "He's still upstairs with his attorney. He asked for access to finance records and was told no." For the first time all day, I felt something close to relief. Not triumph. Relief. Limits were finally appearing around him. Daniel left to coordinate the emergency board call, and I sat alone for 3 minutes with my hands folded over the edge of the desk, breathing slowly and staring at nothing. I think that was the exact moment my marriage ended emotionally. Not at the slap, not at the flask, not even when Sonia called him her husband in public. It ended when I realized that if I did nothing, he would keep stealing and call it leadership. I stood, washed my face in the private office bathroom, pressed a cold paper towel against my cheek, reapplied concealer with the emergency makeup kit I kept in my real handbag, and changed out of the cheap blue blouse into the cream silk shell I had packed that morning without fully knowing why. I kept the black slacks and the flats. I wasn't dressing for revenge. I was dressing to be seen clearly. At 10:15, Arthur arrived. He didn't hug me, didn't say he was sorry, didn't waste a single word on comfort he knew I wouldn't find useful right then. He took one look at my face, one look at the files on the desk, and said, "How bad?" "Bad enough," I said. He pulled out the chair opposite mine and sat down. Daniel joined us. Arthur read the first summary packet in silence, his jaw getting harder with every page. Duplicate vendor flows, unauthorized approval routing, layered reimbursements, executive expense misuse, side channel payments through entities linked to Sonia, access irregularities, the preserve incident report from lunch, security retention notices, preliminary witness statements. When he finished, he set the packet down and asked, "Do you have anything else not in here?" I did. I told him about the conversation I overheard near the private dining area, about the duplicate vendor usage and the buried exception report, about Linda's visible fear, about Sonia blocking my access on the earlier Saturday, about the internal line call from Sonia an hour before. Arthur listened the way my father used to when the answer mattered more than the emotion around it. Then he said, "All right." That was it, just those two words, but they carried the force of decision. By 10:50, 8 board members were on a secured video line, and 3 others were in person on the executive floor because Daniel and Arthur had called them directly. No assistants, no executive staff, no Graham, no management filtering. I sat at the head of the smaller boardroom because Arthur told me to, and because for once, no one tried to make me move. I gave them the facts myself, not as a wounded wife, as owner. I walked them through the incident at lunch first because it established the public conduct and the internal power distortion around Sonia. Then I moved to the preliminary financial findings, not theories, not accusations without grounding, just documented irregularities, linked entities, process interference, and the need for immediate preservation and suspension steps before records could be touched. A few of the directors looked stunned, one looked embarrassed, as another looked like he'd been waiting for something like this for months and hated that he had been right. When I finished, Arthur spoke next. He was blunt in the way only old men with nothing left to prove can be. "We are not here to debate whether this is unpleasant," he said. "We are here to decide whether this board still has the stomach to govern." No one said a word after that. Then Graham entered, not because he was invited, because he had clearly learned where the meeting was and decided he still had enough authority to walk into it. He came in wearing the same suit from lunch, tie loosened now, face composed in that dangerous near calm he used when trying to project command under pressure. His attorney was with him, a sleek corporate litigator I recognized by name. Behind them, for one brief absurd moment, I thought I saw the life I used to have trying to shove its way back into the room through force of habit. Graham stopped when he saw me at the head of the table. Arthur didn't let him speak first. "Sit down," he said. Graham didn't. Instead, he looked around at the board and said, "This is a gross overreaction driven by a marital dispute and incomplete financial context." There it was again, marital dispute. As if that phrase could absorb assault, corruption, and process abuse, if said smoothly enough. I didn't speak. I wanted him to keep talking. His attorney stepped in, voice professional and measured. "My client denies any intentional wrongdoing and strongly objects to emergency action based on preliminary assumptions, emotionally charged allegations, and unverified internal hearsay." Emotionally charged allegations. And I almost admired the efficiency of it. Arthur didn't even glance at him. "Mr. Hart," he said to Graham, "did you or did you not authorize vendor payments to entities connected to Sonia Vale?" Graham's answer came too fast. "Not to my knowledge." Daniel slid a page across the table to Arthur, who slid it to Graham. "Refresh it," Arthur said. Graham looked down. For the first time that night, I saw real fear. Not embarrassment, not irritation, fear, because the signature block was his. One of the wire approvals had routed through an executive override function he had used personally. His attorney leaned in, scanned it, and whispered something to him. Graham's face hardened. These were strategic consulting disbursements. I finally spoke. "From a facilities umbrella?" He turned toward me. "Nick, you don't understand the whole structure." I held his eyes, but then explain why one of the entities routes through an apartment you told me you gave up. That hit harder than any legal point, because half the room didn't care about the apartment as a marital lie. They cared because it tied a personal concealment address to a vendor trail. He looked away first. Arthur asked the next question in a voice so calm it almost sounded tired. Did Sonia Vale have access to executive approvals beyond her role? No. Linda, who had been brought in for factual support, spoke from the far side of the room before she could stop herself. Yes. The room turned. Poor Linda looked like she wanted to disappear, but once the word was out, it was out. Arthur said, "Clarify." Her hands were shaking, but her voice held. She was copied on discretionary request, executive calendar, gatekeeping, budget exception flags, and certain reimbursement cues informally, not on paper in a way that matched title. Graham cut in sharply. That was administrative efficiency. Linda flinched, then to my surprise, straightened. It became coercive, she said. That changed the room. A board can rationalize affair rumors. It can even rationalize suspicious expenses if the numbers are still good. What it cannot comfortably rationalize is a culture in which governance controls are being rerouted through intimidation and private loyalty. Arthur looked around the table. I've heard enough. Graham's attorney objected at once. That would be premature. Arthur ignored him. He called for 2 motions. First, immediate administrative suspension of Graham Hart from all executive authority pending full forensic review, effective tonight with all system access frozen except through counsel. Second, appointment of interim executive authority under the controlling owner, with external audit oversight, outside employment review, and special committee supervision. No one had to ask who that owner was. The vote happened in under 4 minutes. Unanimous. Graham actually laughed when the result came in, but it sounded wrong, thin, like a man hearing his own collapse from the inside. This is insane, he said. You're handing the company to someone who hasn't run day-to-day operations in years. Arthur answered before I could. No, he said. Us, we're handing it back. Security was waiting outside by then because Daniel had planned better than Graham had. Martin entered with 2 guards and a document packet. Graham's attorney started protesting formally. Graham didn't. He just stood there looking at me like he still couldn't reconcile the woman at home with the one in front of him now. Then he made his last mistake. He said, "You think you can do this without me?" I stood up. The room was very quiet. "Yes," I said. "That's the first thing you were ever too arrogant to imagine." He stared at me for another second, then at the board, then at Arthur, and finally at the security packet in Martin's hand. When the reality settled in, it did not make him loud. It made him smaller. He took the packet, said nothing else, and walked out with the guards beside him. No one watched the attorney leave. The room stayed still for a few seconds after the door shut. Not triumphant, just exhausted. Then the real work began. Past midnight, we divided responsibilities. Arthur would chair the Special Oversight Committee. Daniel and Marisol would coordinate the preservation and litigation path. External forensic accountants would be on site at first light. Linda would be placed under protected cooperation status pending full interviews. Sonia was to be terminated immediately, escorted out under record preservation notice, with access revoked and devices seized subject to law. I signed more papers in 90 minutes than I had in some full quarters: suspension orders, authority transfers, audit engagement documents, preservation directives, emergency communication approvals. At 1:30 in the morning, when most of the immediate governance structure was finally in place, I stepped into the hallway alone for the first time since lunch. That was where I found Sonia. She was sitting on a bench near the dark reception alcove, blazer gone, hair loose, mascara smudged, holding her phone with both hands like she didn't know what else to do with them. For the first time, she looked her age, maybe younger, not because she seemed innocent, because she no longer had borrowed power animating her. She looked up when she saw me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "He told me you were cold, that you stayed because of the money and the name." I was too tired for anger by then. "He stayed because of the money and the name," I said. She gave one bitter laugh. "I figured that out." I looked at her for a long moment. This was the woman who had slapped me. The woman who had sat in my place, touched what was mine, called herself by my title in public. I had imagined earlier in the day that if I ever got a moment alone with her after everything, I would feel something dramatic: rage, satisfaction, vindication. What I felt instead was clarity. "You helped him," I said. She didn't deny it. "Not at first," she said quietly. "Then a little. Then too much." "Why?" She looked down at the phone in her hands. "Because men like him don't make you feel used until after you've already sold yourself to the role they wrote for you." That was the smartest thing she said all day. I asked, "Are you going to cooperate?" She closed her eyes for a second, then nodded once. "If my lawyer tells me to?" Fair enough. I left her there. And I checked into a hotel at 2:10 in the morning under Daniel's reservation. I showered, stood under the water until it went almost cold, and only then let myself cry. Not loudly, not beautifully. Just the exhausted, private crying of a woman whose whole life had split open in public and still expected her to be functional by sunrise. By 6:30, I was dressed again. At 8, I walked into Heart Microsystems through the front entrance wearing a navy suit, low heels, and my own name. The energy in the building had completely changed. Not lighter exactly, but honest. Heads turned, conversations paused. Some people looked frightened, some relieved, a few embarrassed. Most simply looked uncertain, as if the building itself had been told overnight that gravity worked differently now. Good. Truth should feel disruptive when a lie has been running payroll. I spent the next 3 weeks inside conference rooms, audit reviews, leadership briefings, and legal strategy calls. We found more than I even expected. Not just the veil-linked entities. There were layered reimbursements for travel, hospitality misuse, side agreements hidden under generic consulting language, and a network of smaller compliance evasions that depended on everyone below executive level believing none of it was their place to question. It was ugly, but it was finite. That mattered too, because once a thing can be counted, it can be cut out. Graham tried briefly to negotiate through counsel. He proposed a quiet separation, then a settlement framework, and then an operational transition package as if he were a departing executive and not the reason we had 3 audit teams crawling through the last 18 months. The board rejected everything that involved reputation laundering. Sonia did cooperate eventually, partially at first, and then in full. Once it became obvious Graham intended to protect himself by minimizing her role publicly while blaming her privately. She provided messages, approval rotes, and context around how the side entities were set up. It did not absolve her. It simply finished the map. The divorce was filed before the month ended, quietly, efficiently, with more documents than dialogue. I moved out of the house before Graham could return to retrieve his personal things, not because I was afraid of him physically, but because I refused to stage one last domestic scene in a kitchen where I had spent too many nights making dinner for a man rehearsing lies in his head. 3 months later, the company announced an internal governance restructuring, external audit completion, executive misconduct separation, and interim to permanent leadership transition under my office. We did not mention my marriage in the statement. That part belonged to me. A year later, when people asked how I had handled it, they usually wanted an inspirational answer. Something neat, something about resilience and destiny and women discovering power after betrayal. The truth was less polished. I handled it because there was no one else left to do it. I handled it because I was tired of men mistaking my quiet for absence. I handled it because my father built something real. And when I could not let a charming thief turn it into a private allowance. And I handled it because the day that woman slapped me in public over my husband's flask, something simple and permanent became clear. The most dangerous thing you can do to a patient woman is assume she still has no limit. The last time I saw Graham in person was at a settlement conference months later. He looked older, not broken exactly, just reduced. Like someone who had confused borrowed authority with his own reflection for so long that losing it made him visually smaller. He tried once, while the lawyers were out of the room, to tell me he had loved me in his way. I believed him. That was the saddest part, because his way had included lying to me, using my grief, sleeping with his subordinate, letting her raise a hand to me in public, as in skimming from the company my father built while calling it leadership. So I told him the truth. Your way was never enough. Then I stood up and left him there. These days I keep a flask in my office, not his, mine, Matte Silver. No initials, no sentiment attached to it at all. Sometimes during long afternoons, I fill it with ginger tea and set it on the corner of my desk while I review quarterly reports or product updates or hiring proposals. Every now and then, I catch sight of it and think about that lunch floor, that slap, that silence right before everything changed. People like to say revenge is best served cold. That has never sounded true to me. What I served wasn't revenge, it was consequence.